Do you care if you are remembered? Do you think about your legacy and what you might be leaving behind? Dr. Erwin Warkentin and I discuss the meaning of legacy. Welcome to Tales Under the Cat Tree. I'm your host, Dupes, and these are tales by humans for humans. After all, words and stories are what give meaning to the worlds we live in. The things we leave behind. The message that my father had passed away arrived as a text from my brother in Sri Lanka while I was pitching to an investor in a boardroom somewhere in Toronto, Canada. My brother had called, but the phone was on vibrate and I ignored it. The echoing text arrived just a short minute later. I don't know why I reached into my pocket and glanced while I kept motioning at my slides, but I did. I remember I paused in mid-sentence, and with the mind of a deer in headlights, I just continued. As I was leaving, shaking hands with the investor, for whatever reason, he asked, "Is everything okay?" Matter-of-factly, I answered, "My father just passed away. That was my brother on the phone." I left. I don't know what he thought of me. I do know they didn't invest in my startup. It is possible he thought I was a callous, cold, or possibly in shock. I can't remember if I had explained that I had just left Sri Lanka a mere fortnight past. I had seen my father at 81 after the brain surgery to remove the tumor that killed him anyway. He was in the same well-dressed pants and shirt, silver pen tucked asleep at the breast. My last vision was him waving, crying, holding on to my mother who had fretted over him. This was the last of the dozen goodbyes since they had moved to Sri Lanka and I to Canada. The text had merely stated a pre-announced fate. It was not home that I went when I arrived in Kingston, Ontario that afternoon by train from Toronto. Instead, the taxi driver dropped me mid-afternoon on a weekday at the Pilot House pub. The waiter, James, poured me a Guinness. I sat at the corner table opposite an empty chair, sipped the foam, played Take Me Home Country Roads by John Denver, and shared a toast to my father. At that point, if you had asked me what he left behind, I would have said the many memories. Maybe the numerous friends, patients, and relatives who toast his health, now going well past a decade. I even went to visit the small area of the university dedicated to him after he having been instrumental in its construction. His study, where he saw patients at the farm on weekends with a tidy red ceramic floor, remains, though it now doubles as a small Buddhist shrine my mother uses daily. On a rare occasion, I can see the shadows of his fingerprints in some of the books, still dusty and unmoved. Some years after, I thought back to my own life, and I thought that what my father had left behind was probably reflected in the way I told my stories. I thought maybe my almost obsessive need to connect with dear friends was something he had left in me. Maybe it was the way I laughed, the way I was always curious about history, or maybe it was in ABBA or Boney M. "Dulipa Chutiputa," he would say while opening a cold Guinness at the apartment in Hong Kong. "Play some Fernando, or Brown Girl in the Ring." And that day when he passed and I had had that Guinness, I thought that simple act was something he had left behind. Just a few years ago, I came across all the letters my father had written me. In them, I thought I had found something he had definitely left behind. They always started the same: "My dear Chutiputa, my dear young son." In November 1993, for example, he writes, "It is raining heavily." Weather was a big theme. Politics, dogs, economics, and somehow getting me married off covers the rest. Always, in every letter, there was my mother, Amma, the busybody, without whom he would be lost. Last year, my hair grayed and thinned. My cheeks took a slightly older shape. One morning, lathering my face to shave, there, staring out at me, was none other than my father. So here we are, driving down the country roads of Finland.
Yes, not too far from Russia.
So, Erwin, you posed a very interesting question to me, which I want to delve a little bit deeper into. What is it that you wish to leave behind? Or how do you wish to be remembered, is, I believe, the way you phrased the question.
First of all, I'm not sure that it matters what I wish, but doesn't mean I don't have wishes. How do I wish to be remembered? As a good person? As someone who tried to do good things for people? Someone who could write? Someone whose writings cause people to think? And by think, I don't mean agree with me, but just to cause people to think about issues, about things. And that's probably how I want to be remembered.
And then I said to you, because you asked me the question, and of course, how do I wish to be remembered? And I said, I don't want to be remembered, or I don't think I will be remembered. And I think that's a very interesting thing for me, because remember, what does that mean? To me, being remembered means, what have I left behind? What is the point of, I guess, the existence that I have created, and what gets remembered down the line? And I don't know that there is anything that I will do that will be remembered beyond, well, the people I know and the people I care about. But will I be remembered in a generation, 2 generations, or 3 generations? I don't think I will be.
I don't think that being remembered is really something that's relevant, or what we want ourselves to be remembered as. I don't think that's relevant in the least bit, because people construct memories of individuals. So what you've done or what you would like doesn't matter a whit. It's however that memory that they might have, that construct of you, how does that serve their purposes? What does that do for them? How does that make them feel? If I want to feel good, I think of the people that I've had contact with in my life. I think of my mother and my father, things like that. But what do I remember about them? It's not so much the deeds, but rather the feeling.
So I have a theory. If you really wish to be remembered, if you really wish for generations to remember you. Now, let's think about this. If we're looking back even on history, only a few, very few individuals are remembered.
Yeah.
There's, the kings and those who led great wars or wrote great books or something like that gets remembered. But I think if you want something, so my theory is that if you want something to be remembered, it's kind of like DNA. It has to become pervasive in the society and the culture, because that's true remembrance. And a good example of that, I think, is the Beatles.
Okay.
The Beatles as a music band are fundamentally an amazing music band, and they have songs. Some people like them, some people don't like them. But their impact on society and their impact on history is that they influence so many more bands, musicians, and that continues to get passed on down the ages, and thereby preserving or creating that sense of remembrance. It's like a little bit of DNA that gets passed on. Now, what's really fascinating for me is I don't have any children and I won't have any children.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, my DNA will not get passed on. Is there anything that I'm doing culturally that is significant enough that changes around me and around for people that will get passed along? I don't believe so, but of course I don't know yet.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't know, and you will never know. Not for sure. Anyway, in my case, for example, I've had interactions with many different students at university. You're an example of that. Now we're having this conversation now, what is it, 32 years after we first met? Almost 32 years after we first met. And we've remembered one another in the meantime. And there's certain things that I will do that when I think of it, when I reconsider what I've done, that's kind of a dupes thing to do. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but it's kind of, oh, yeah, okay, I'm recognizing the influence that you've had. See, it doesn't work just one way, teacher to student, but it works the other way too, for me at least, that students have often had an impact on me. But students will sometimes come to me, or former students, that I haven't had in the classroom for 20 years or 15 years or whatever. And they will say something like, "Oh, this will always stick with me." And they will come up with a sentence, a thought, where on occasion I might think, "Oh, gee, that was profound. Are you sure I said that? You're not, mixing your memories, or that it's a false memory of some sort?" But very often it's something that I might have considered almost a throwaway thought, something that was meant for consumption in the moment, and then that's it, done. But that will have stuck with them. And for them, that's an important thing. And it's something that's formed a part of their character. It's become part of their DNA, their developmental DNA, as it were, not their physical DNA, but their developmental DNA. And so I have the good fortune on occasion of discovering that I've had an impact on someone. But for the most part, I'll never know what my impact actually is.
Now, let me ask you a question. If we're thinking about this as DNA, like
Yeah,
things that pass along, become pervasive,
yeah,
that spread into the culture, and then gets reformed and repackaged and changes the culture because of the things that
yeah.
you did. How many generations do you think that can actually last?
I can say that it probably will last at least 4 generations, because I know that I act in certain ways because of my father, and not his physical DNA, but the way he's talked to me, the way I was punished as a child, the way I was taught by him as a child, because I've passed that on to my children. And I can at times see glimpses of that appearing in how they're raising their children, so my grandchildren. So there's 4 generations at least where I can say that my father's impact on me has this echo effect, or this resonance through these generations. Like real physical DNA, the strands become shorter and not as pervasive. It gets mixed in with the other stuff that's out there. And so, even though we may not always recognize it immediately, it may actually still be there. There may be little ticks that a person has that have come out of, something from generations ago. I would suggest that there's probably more of an impact than we sometimes would like to think that there is, or may even feel comfortable thinking that there is. Now, the problem is, of course, that we don't have, or we haven't, the kinds of recordings of our grandparents, great grandparents, great great grandparents, the way we do today. For example, I can look at a video of, the way my father may have walked down the aisle at my wedding, but I don't have that of my great 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 grandfather. That there was a certain way that he and my then future father-in-law walked down the aisle. They looked as though they were going to be the guests of honor at a firing squad, the two of them. But that was simply the way they did things, and to some degree, that's been passed on to me as well. When I enter a room somewhere, and I have a ceremonial thing to do, it becomes a strange sort of thing. But yeah, there is some of this passing on of this DNA of how we think, how we tick, how we talk. My wife says, for example, when she sees that, or she gets a phone call from our son and she hasn't looked at who's calling, she will have trouble sometimes differentiating who it is, whether it's me or whether it's him. It's not just the voice, she says, but it's also the manner of speaking, the vocabulary choice, all kinds of little things like that. And those things do get passed on.
I find it quite fascinating also that my mother tells me, strangely, that I resemble to her my grandfather, who I've never met. My
Mhm.
grandfather passed away in the early 60s, and I was born more than a decade later. But she says, I resemble my grandfather. Now, what I find fascinating is I'm not entirely sure that's in the DNA so much as
I think my mother over the years has implanted certain ideas. My grandmother may have implanted certain ideas into my head about how my grandfather acted.
Mhm.
And therefore, I have taken on those mannerisms.
Yeah.
It is
Okay.
almost learned and then reinforced learning of what maybe my grandfather was like. And therefore, now I am perpetuating that,
Hmm.
which I find quite fascinating. And I don't know if that is true. And maybe someday, somewhere in the future, we'll find out that actually there is some sort of, hidden subconscious that gets passed from mother to fetus to so on. But until that happens, I think that's how I have learned it.
But I think also some of that could also be projection, that the other person is projecting something onto you that may or may not necessarily be there, or may be there only in a very small dosage, and they may be making a bigger thing of it. I had an experience with my Aunt Sarah. She was, well, we were at my sister's wedding, and then they had, the reception afterwards and a nice dinner. And then they also had some dancing, which was for Mennonites kind of an odd sort of experience because we tend not to dance. My Aunt Sarah came up to me, and she hadn't seen me in a while, and she was kind of my favorite aunt because she was the youngest aunt, so she was maybe cooler than all the rest. And she had also spent a lot more time in the city than my other aunts had. And she came up to me and she put her arms around me and she says, "Oh, it's so nice to see you, George." And she put her head on my shoulder. My name's not George. And I kind of looked at her, I backed away a little bit and I looked down at her, and she looked up with one eye and she says, "I know you're not George, but you remind me so much of him." George is her older brother, is her oldest brother. He had passed away a number of years ago, and he had this kind of bigger than life personality. He was kind of cool, and I idolized him as well. So I didn't necessarily see this as an insult in any way at all, but I found it kind of odd because I think she was actually projecting things onto me that weren't necessarily there.
So let's go back to being remembered. Many, many people, especially those who become famous or those who wish to become famous, will say the words, "I wish to be remembered. This is my legacy that I wish to leave behind.
Mhm.
This company is my legacy. This building is my legacy. This idea is my legacy. This music is my legacy." What would you say to that? Do you think that's even something that is possible?
Well, I would say, first of all, if I were talking directly to the person, you're assuming that you have any control over your legacy. And I would suggest to them that they have no control over their legacy at all. Yes, they can throw stuff out there. They can sponsor a nice new building, for example, at a university. And I've worked with some cases where people have provided money to the university and a building has been constructed and eventually their name gets put on it. But whether they are then remembered in association with that, that's not up to them. That's up to the people that come afterwards and how they interpret that person's legacy and what they've done. For example, could turn out that the person in real life was a real jerk. And there are examples of that at universities. And I'm not going to name names, but there's some very specific examples that I can think of where a person has been really quite reprehensible in terms of how they've handled employees and so on and so forth. But later in life, they want to be remembered positively. And so what they do is they throw money at the issue of their legacy, and a lot of it. Well, that doesn't always work out because sometimes these people are then eventually remembered for who they really were. So they don't have control over that legacy. Yeah, the building's there. Yeah, it has their name on it. But there have been cases where universities have had to reconsider whether they want to keep being associated with that name. So the building may be there, but the legacy is actually what people think of you. It's not the building that's the legacy. It's what people perceive you to have been.
Everything is ephemeral, whether it's music or whether it's on the side of a building. Everything is ephemeral, and everything is associated to the culture of the times we live in.
Yeah.
Slavery statues or people celebrating the slave trade were seen as great heroes back then. But the truth is, not so much anymore, as we understand the truth and we understand the people that were brought through the slave trade. All of these change.
And sometimes I think we're also very hard on these historic characters. Now, I'm not suggesting, I'm not trying to whitewash, pardon the pun, the slave trade, but this is what was normal in that society. And they were engaged in a heinous activity. As far as I'm concerned, I don't care. Back then, I would still have thought it as being a heinous activity, because there's a lot of kind of mental flip-flops that they had to go through to justify what they were doing. They had to go to the Bible and say, oh yeah, okay, the mark of Cain is upon these people, and thus we're allowed to enslave them. So I think basically deep down they knew that there was a problem with it. But sometimes they get caught up in history, or the way history is interpreted and then reinterpreted. And so, shall we say that a statue of John A. Macdonald may not serve our purposes any longer? And I think it comes down to a matter of utility. Do the memory of these people serve us a utility? Are they useful to us? And very often now I think we're saying, no, not really. They're not part of who we are. So maybe we have to set them aside. Now, if we're going to have someone and raise them to the level of an icon, they are raised to the level of icon at our pleasure. And here, I mean, from one generation to the next, these things change. So they have to also take the bad with the good.
And this goes back to Roman and Greek times, as gods would come and go, as different villages would venerate one type of god, and so on. They would have statues, and then it would change, and then and. So all of these things are ephemeral, and we shouldn't be sitting here thinking that these are all set in, quote unquote, set in stone.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about art, because that's another one. If you talk to a musician, it is, I am writing this so that future generations will remember me, will remember the music that I have created.
Okay.
Now, we talked about the Beatles and the fact that they are pervasive. But art, the idea of any sort of art, whether it's music, whether it's drawn art or sculpted art, well, how do you see that as being remembrance of, or harking back to the person who created it?
Well, that again is very much in the hands of whoever is doing the remembering at the time. There are artists, and right now I'm trying desperately to remember the name of this particular artist. He was a Baroque artist who was essentially completely forgotten until he was rediscovered in the early 1900s. And then all of a sudden, his art was pulled out of the vaults. It was kind of kept in the vaults. No one had the heart to get rid of it, but they didn't really find it all that interesting until it was reinterpreted by someone. And somehow there was kind of this, today we talk about something being a viral meme. He became, in some respects, now I remember his name, Caravaggio. You know Caravaggio, you know his works.
Mhm.
He was a nothing at the beginning of the 1900s. He was rediscovered. And this works the same with many other artists. We have artists today that, in their time, Van Gogh, people didn't, at the time, he couldn't sell his paintings. Basically, he had a hard time giving them away. Mind you, that was more because he didn't give them away. But he couldn't sell his paintings. But today, he's considered one of the absolute greats of the artistic world. So they may want to leave this behind, but it's up to us to make a judgment on it and determine whether it's something worthwhile in our life.
And that means that in the future, someone will look at our stuff that we have done and judge whether the stuff we have done is worthwhile to them, which begs the question, when people do things for the sake of being remembered, does it matter?
No, it doesn't. I've been writing things for ages, and I did write a memoir of sorts. This was an exercise that my daughter put me and Sylvia, my wife, through. Every week we would get a topic to write about, and it was up to us then to write something about it. And it forced us to spend an entire year writing about questions that my daughter had prepared for us. And part of the idea was to leave something behind for my grandsons so that they would have something to remember us by. So that can work on a certain way, but it's really up to, shall we say, my grandsons to pick it up. I have so much hubris that I assume that they're even going to be interested. How's that?
It's a very hard topic because as humans, we're looking for purpose. And purpose can mean having children and passing something along. And so over the generations, there's been quadrillion, who knows how many people who have actually had consciousness in this planet and passed on. And yet we remember so few.
Yeah.
And many by accident, not even by design.
Okay, but now are you talking about there's so few that we remember as a society, as a group, or as individuals?
I think both. When you think about it from the perspective of a society, we remember the ones that have affected society, whatever that is, history, whatever you want to term as history. Even as individuals, I can trace back to my grandfather, maybe my great-grandfather. My brother has done more research, can probably go back to my great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother on different sides of the family. But it stops at some point. It absolutely stops. And the things that we know aren't really that important. We know who they married, we might know what they did, we might know what work they did, or where they traveled to. But really, do we know who they were?
No, I don't think we do. This being remembered, over the generations is kind of a tricky thing. But the thing is that in the end, we are actually creations of the interaction of all of these people over time.
Unfortunately, the recording Erwin and I made in the car cut short right here. Erwin asked me one final question. Do I care about how I am actually remembered? Is that why I do the things I do? The truth is, I know what I will do will not be remembered. I do what I do simply for the moment that I live in. I care more that I do things as well and as ethically as I can, that I leave things behind just a little bit better than what I found them in, and that I tell you a story that makes you think differently. Do I give a crap that in 100 years I'm a meme? Nope, don't care. And if I am, and this recording survives, and you can still even understand this language, good on you. Enjoy. Thank you to Dr. Erwin Warkentin. This was the second of 2 car conversations while driving in northern Finland. You can listen to episode number 62 about home and the meaning of home for the first one. Erwin will join me on future episodes. We have a lot lined up. If you want to reach Dr. Warkentin or me, you can send a message to contact@dupes.ca. That's contact@dups.ca. Listen to the archives wherever you get your podcasts or at tales.dupes.ca. That's tales.dups.ca. This podcast is about the worlds we create, the realities we conjure, and the wonders of the human imagination. This podcast, including its intro music, is produced, edited, and created by me, your host, Dileepa Wijewardena. If you are lucky enough to have a pet, give them some treats and a cuddle until we meet again for some tales under the cat tree.